why don't we get going? I'm sure we'll get a few more people joining us in the next few minutes. A very unusual panel, a little bit sort of chaotic. Very sorry about this. But it's still my great pleasure to welcome you all to the Populist seminar, and which of course is a initiative by Andrei Zaslov and Maritz Myers from Radboud University, Robert Huber, who's here from the University of Salzburg, and myself, Annika Werner. And it's my great pleasure to welcome everyone and to introduce our two speakers today, Sofia Ammassari from Griffith University, another Australian for once, which is fantastic, great to see. And then we have Luca Versteegen from the University of Gothenburg here with us today, and they're going to present their very fresh and new work on radical right populist party members and how much and why they feel ostracized because of their politics. Now, before we get going and hand over to Sofia, just as per usual, very quickly to remind everyone of the house rules. This panel today is being recorded, and it is unusually not a webinar format today, but it's a normal Zoom link. So it is important that everybody keeps their camera switched off and their microphone switched off if they're not talking. And for the video, it is also good that only the person who speaks during the two presentations has their camera on, so that our focus is on that person and their presentation. And then when we come to the Q&A session, you can everybody in the audience can type their questions into the chat, or of course raise your hand icon, and we're going to then ask you to open your mic and ask your question. So as I said, because this is a normal Zoom room today, we really ask everyone to be on guard, that you're sure to have your microphone muted if you're not speaking. And with that, it's my great pleasure to stop sharing my screen and hand over to Sofia and her presentation. Take it away.
Thank you, Annika, and thank Robert for organizing this. I'm going to share my screen now. Can you see it? Thumbs up, if you can. Okay, wonderful. All right, so, okay, so hi everyone, and thanks for having me here today. My name is Sofia Ammassari, and I'm a PhD researcher at Griffith University. And today, I'm going to present a paper which is the first from my PhD project, which looks at party membership of populist radical right parties, or PRR parties. And specifically, we are going to talk about stigmatization. So, stigmatization is one of the main obstacles to the success of PRR parties. And one of its most detrimental effects is on the recruitment and the retention of grassroots members, who can face severe social and material sanctions because they get involved in these parties. Still, not much has been written about this effect of stigmatization, except for a book published in 2011 by David Art entitled Inside the Radical Right. Still, the question of what drives feeling of stigmatization among PRR party members, which is the one that I'm going to address today, is an important one because it has implication in the way PRR parties organize. For instance, in terms of who comes forward as candidates, or the role which is ascribed to PRR grassroots members. So with today's presentation, I'm going to address this research question. starting by the current explanation of how stigma works that we can find in the literature. I will highlight the limitations and argue how the role of the personal networks in which these PRR grassroots members are embedded is crucial in order to understand how stigmatization works. And I will test this new theoretical framework with a survey of about 7,000 grassroots members of the Sweden Democrats. And these interview results will be integrated with qualitative material from interview data with 30 of them. And what I find is that PRR grassroots members differ in the way they feel stigmatized, and these differences depend on the personal networks, therefore on the people they are surrounded by. So starting from what we know about who joined these parties is not much, and especially for those most stigmatized. According to Art, the individuals who join are either extremists, so people who have no problems flouting social norms, and people who have little to lose in terms of employment and social relations. Now, there are two assumptions deriving from this work. The first one is that if you join this kind of parties, you are not susceptible to stigmatization because the costs are just so high after once get involved. And the second is that whether people feel stigmatized or not depends on ideology. Therefore, if you're an extremist, you don't care much about the stigma. If you're more moderate, you do. And socioeconomic status. So if you have a lower socioeconomic status, you probably do not care that much. Or if you have a higher socioeconomic status, you are more susceptible to stigmatization. Now, the mechanisms underpinning these are not very clear. And I think the main problem with this framework is that it overlooks the fact that stigma is a relational concept. So it is defined as an attribute that is deeply discrediting, but this label is attached by society. Therefore, whether a social identity, in this case, being a PRR sympathizer, is discredited depends on the reaction of others in a determined social context. And this is the premise upon which I built my theoretical framework. So I developed three original hypotheses on the role of personal networks in determining feelings of stigmatization. And the first hypothesis is that PRR party members who have had relatives and or friends in the party will be less likely to feel stigmatized. And this is because we know that social norms are very important in driving any sort of political behavior, from vote choice to joining a political party. Therefore, when we take these political choices, we care about the opinions of the people around us. And the second and the third hypothesis work a little bit differently. So the second hypothesis is that the higher the educational level of PRR party members, the more likely that they will feel stigmatized. And so this is based on, studies of sociology that have long shown that when we build our personal networks, we tend to follow the homophily principle. Therefore, we tend to hang out, become friends, build families with people who have similar educational qualification and similar educational level. We also know that education is one of the strongest predictors of populist radical right support. Therefore, people with lower educational level are overrepresented among PRR sympathizers. And for instance, people with a university degree are underrepresented. Therefore, one can expect that those people who actually have higher educational qualifications will be more likely to be surrounded by people who do not share their political views in comparison to someone, who has not finished secondary school. And a similar line of thought is behind hypothesis 3, which is PRR party members working in the public sector will be more likely to feel stigmatized. Again, we know that public employees, at least in Western democracies, tend to vote overwhelmingly for left-wing parties. And again, they are underrepresented among PRR sympathizers. So I expect that those PRR grassroots members who are employed, I don't know, in healthcare or schools will more likely be surrounded by colleagues who are hostile to their political views. And I tested this theoretical framework on the grassroots membership of the Sweden Democrats. So at the end of 2021, I conducted a membership survey with the help of the party secretariat, and the response rate was actually very good. It was about 25%. And today the analysis I'm going to talk about is based on about 7,000 SD grassroots members. And in addition to this, I also conducted 30 online interviews with a selection of members from 2 Swedish counties. One is Skåne, which is a place where the SD has been historically strong, whereas the other is Stockholm County, where the SD has been historically weak. And I managed to strike a reasonable balance in terms of gender, age, and year of joining of my interviewees. So I will now present you the findings of my study, starting from the spread of my dependent variable, which was measured by asking to SD grassroots members the extent to which they agreed with the following survey item that I've taken from the members and activists of political parties questionnaires by Emil Van Oot and Annika Gauja. So the sentence was, "It is not easy to publicly admit that I'm a member of the SD." And as you can see, despite the fact that recently it seems that, in recent year at least, seems that the cordon sanitaire around the SD is trembling and so on, still about 60% of the members find it hard to talk about their membership. And to conduct my statistical analysis, I created a dummy variable for this. So the people that somewhat agreed and strongly agreed are those who feel stigmatized, and those who strongly disagreed or somewhat disagreed are those who do not feel stigmatized. So this is my statistical analysis, and here you can see the drivers of feelings of stigmatization among SD grassroots members. So above the horizontal black line, you can see my independent variables, and they are all strongly correlated with feelings of stigmatization. So as I expected, those who have had any personal ties, so either relatives or friends in the party, are less likely to feel stigmatized. And the higher the educational level, the more likely that this member find their membership discrediting. And public employees were more wary about talking about their membership than other rank and file. And so these findings provide support for all my 3 hypotheses. Then in terms of the controls, I just want to discuss some of them, and then we can maybe have a chat during the Q&A. But so those who are outside the workforce, so we could say those who have nothing to lose, to use Art's word, in terms of material cost. So this group includes, I don't know, students, retired people, unemployed, and so on, are no less likely to find their membership discrediting in comparison to people who are employed. The same for different levels of economic well-being. This was not a significant predictor of feeling of stigmatization, while there is some support for the idea that the more extremist you are, so the farther you place yourself on the right, the less likely that you feel stigmatized. But actually the effect is very small, and this finding doesn't hold across further robustness checks. Now, as I said before, in order to understand more in depth how stigmatization work and how these elements work as drivers of stigmatization, I also conducted 30 online interviews, and I'm now going to share some of the quotes that I collected. So starting from education, that has the strongest effect among my variables, the idea was really that as member 20 put it, the university in Sweden are very, very radical lefty. So this guy is still a physics student, and he confessed, and then when they found out that he was involved in the ST, as you can read, people start to spit on the grounds when they saw him in the corridor and things like that. And this was not only limited to the educational sector, but there was really the idea that all public institutions were dominated by people with left-wing views. And here I have the experience of member 8, who is a social worker. And she joined back in 2009, and no one knew yet that she was a member of the Sweden Democrats, because as she confessed to me, she was afraid that maybe she would lose her job. And that was actually the case for some of my other interviewees that were fired or lost job opportunities because of their political involvement. And finally, in terms of the dynamics about personal ties, there were several that were raised in the interviews, but I would like to highlight this one that member 15 talked about. So she explained how by having someone in the party, like having personal ties in the party, reduce the stigma of joining it in first place. Because as she says, if one takes the step, it's easier for the rest to take the step. So she joined with a bunch of relatives, and she felt more comfortable in doing so. Other interviewees highlighted how not only reduced the stigma of joining the party, but it also reduced the stigma of becoming active in it. So for instance, showing up at the first party meetings and so on. So there are 3 main takeaways from my presentation. The first is that the personal networks in which these PRR party members are embedded are key in order to understand stigmatization. And even those socioeconomic variables such as education or being employed in the public sector do not matter merely because of the economic sanctions one could incur in by getting involved, but they are more related to the kind of people these individuals surround themselves with. So in addition to make a theoretical contribution, this presentation also makes an empirical one, in that it counters some of the prevailing wisdom about how stigma works among PRR party members. The second point relates to the fact that PRR party members, but party members in general, differ in the way they experience their membership. I think when we study memberships, we tend to treat these as monolithic blocks. So we do not pay much attention to the ways in which gender, age, economic status, whatever, can affect patterns of engagement. However, as I've shown through this paper, these individual levels factors are really likely to affect the way grassroots members live their membership. And finally, my paper has illustrated how mixed methods research can really bring additional insights to the study of party membership. For instance, while through the survey, I could uncover the different relationships within my independent variables and feelings of stigmatization, it was only through the interviews that I could really reveal the mechanisms that were behind those relationships. So thank you very much for listening, and I look forward to your questions and feedback.
Thank you so much, Sophia. There's some clapping going on in the audience. And yeah, if the audience already has any questions or comments, you can save them for the Q&A session or already put them into the chat. But before we get to that, I'll hand over to Luca for his paper.
Sure. Wait, can you see that? Yes, great. Okay, there's the thumbs up. Yeah, thanks a lot for being here and having me. I really like this seminar series and actually the opportunity to present my research on this panel because I think it fits quite well to what Sophia just said. So in this presentation, I'm not so much looking into how radical right voters actually feel stigmatized as Sophia has done, but actually at what social groups these radical right voters belong to or experience to belong to, and whether they feel included within the larger society at all. And as I can see the literature right now, there are actually two camps. On the first hand, we see that they often consider themselves as very prototypical, ordinary people of society, and this is also in line of the definition of radical right voters being these ordinary people. And as you all know, probably they often belong to historically dominant groups: white people, men, older people, and so on. So actually, they're quite central in society. However, then on the other side, we all know that there are all these narratives about who these people are and that they're somewhat marginalized, ostracized, socially excluded people in society, the left behind, strangers in their own land, you name it. So my question in this paper is actually, how does that fit together? How can you be prototypical or consider yourself ordinary and be marginalized at the same time? And in my view, this doesn't really go together well. So I've formalized this question a bit, asking under what conditions can members of a dominant group experience social exclusion, and how is this social exclusion experience then related to radical right support? And this is not so much a predictive question, but for my very first qualitative project that I'm actually conducting, I really wanted to describe people's experiences of social exclusion and perhaps also how this is related to radical right support. And I approached this issue with a social psychological theory developed by Marilyn Brewer, where she basically argues that individuals have two identity needs. They try to belong to a larger whole, and simultaneously they try to remain unique with whatever is making them distinct. And then organizational psychologists around Shore argued that this is actually what social inclusion could be about. So you try to belong to a larger whole, but you also try to remain unique. And just notice that this is very different from our common understanding of social inclusion, which basically argues as soon as you belong to the larger whole, you are included. And here they say, well, this is important, belonging is important, but this is not enough. If you don't feel recognized for whatever is making you special or unique within the larger group, then you continue to feel excluded. And to illustrate this, I've drawn you a little society here. This is the center of society here, the margins. And for radical right voters, I argue the first inclusion need is really satisfied, right? They belong to society. They consider themselves central members of society. However, I argue that the second need is not satisfied. They feel not recognized for their subgroup memberships. So for being a man, for having a traditional sexual orientation, for being white, and so on. And this is not to say that this is the case. This is very important, but a subjective experience of being unrecognized. And therefore, if you understand social inclusion as this realm of optimal distinctiveness where both needs are satisfied, I argue that radical right voters tend to be socially excluded at society's center. They strongly belong, but they don't feel recognized. And this is basically what I tried to examine together with my colleague Gefion Off. We conducted interviews with radical right voters in Germany, and we first sorted out the ethics and funding stuff, developed our interview guide where we were interested in a couple of issues related to voters' perception of societal developments. And this is basically what we did with 30 interviewees then. As you can see, this was mostly done in Eastern Germany, which is not so much because of the theoretical reasons that are discussed in the literature, but just because of practical issues. Some of you may know that it's much easier to find a radical right voter in East Germany than in West Germany, or the former GDA states, I should say. And we conducted these interviews with them, and I should say that I think we did quite well in terms of age representation, age from 18 to 71. We had a male bias, and there are some voters who were politically active on a local level. All of them were white, and 6 of the interviews were, for practical reasons, conducted online. These were mostly the interviews that aren't in Eastern Germany. After transcribing the interviews, I conducted a thematic analysis on this question of perceptions of social inclusion in terms of belonging to the larger group and being different from it. Just for the recruitment, because I've received these questions in earlier presentations, what we did is we emailed radical right politicians in the area asking for potential voters, but then also posted on social media sites and direct messaging. Here you can see my colleague Gefjon. We just tried to organize interviews by direct messaging, and this was actually often the strategy that worked best. Yeah, just as I've already said that, there's a higher share of radical right voters in East Germany. This is, or to some extent, probably due to Germany's divided history. I won't go into much detail in this paper, but this certainly also plays a role with regards to people's social inclusion perceptions. And the context was that we conducted these interviews right before the federal elections last year, so August 2020. And besides the upcoming election, relevant themes were that there was COVID ongoing, and radical right voters tend to have difficulties with COVID regulations, and then also the withdrawal of international forces from Afghanistan, where people expressed their concerns for additional refugees coming in. As for any qualitative project, as I've learned, it's important to also reflect on positionality. We are what Britain calls sample insiders, because both of us researchers were or are white and native Germans. However, we are sample outsiders in the sense that we actually supported the COVID regulations, that we are from a city from Western Germany that most East Germans may consider more cosmopolitan and actually also slightly arrogant at some points, which is probably true. And we are living and working abroad for a university, which kind of makes us highly educated, I guess. And finally, neither of us supports the AfD, and we obviously try to keep this background as silent as possible, but obviously we also didn't deny it to establish report. Yeah, and then we conducted, I conducted this thematic analysis, and you may know that Boyatzis suggests that there are some quality criteria for a good code. You first, after having kind of read and familiarized yourself with the data, you develop these 5 quality criteria. You have a label of a code and define what this code is about. You describe where you can find it in the data, develop inclusion and exclusion criteria, and then have an example. And this is basically what you do first, and these codes are then used to first be validated on the whole data set. You then test intra-rater reliability or even inter-rater reliability a month later, and then you apply it to the whole data. And based on these codes, these codes basically represent the themes that you find in your data regarding your research question, and you can examine how these codes relate to each other and represent your themes that you're interested in. So in my case, belonging and uniqueness to society. And I actually don't have too much time to talk about the results. Just to remember, I was interested in people's experience of belonging to the larger group and being different from that larger group with whatever subgroup was relevant to them. And I'm happy to share the results in more detail in a paper, but just to briefly show you how this looks like. This is the first dimension, belonging, where I identified 3 themes. The first one was experiencing Germanness. So people were actually quite good at defining what German culture is about in their eyes. And they said that they felt to be German, and they were quite good at recalling events that they considered German. So for example, specific sports events and so on, or religious events. And then secondly, they also were quite good at developing boundaries from what they consider German and not German. So for example, they said that Muslims wouldn't be German, or French people wouldn't be German. So they were good at defining not only what Germany is about, but also what Germany in their eyes is not about. they called others to assimilate, so both outgroup members, but also the often left green Germans that weren't considered real Germans, that could kind of like should recognize their values and assimilate to that. Consequently, they were quite proud of being German, and also when we challenged them with any difficult questions about German history, for example, or German politics right now, they felt offended and were willing to defend this to a varying extent. And then finally, you could also see that there was some problem with their experience of belonging to the larger group. So they obviously strongly belong to that group, but they also lamented this decay of Germanness, and this has been raised in the literature often with regards to resentment and nostalgia, that people lament this decay of their national societies, for example, in Sweden and Germany and so on. And also they felt really stuck, actually, for being German, said, well, we are what we kind of like save German culture, but we actually would like to allow ourselves also being different to some extent. And this relates to the second dimension of inclusion, uniqueness. The first theme being quite simple. This is just the groups that people identified, gender, political, and this is probably what where Sophia's work becomes relevant here, because this is where people felt stigmatized or excluded, unrecognized for their political subgroup. And then there were also age, disability, poverty, white ethnicity, and being from former GDR states or current East German states. The subgroups were relevant to them. They were quite good at defining them. However, it was surprising that often they actually represent majority groups or socially dominant groups in society, how little they experienced being seen, being recognized for these groups. And very much related, I guess, is that they were often not aware of the privileges you have as a man in Germany nowadays, or as a white citizen, and so on. And then finally, and this is really this lack of uniqueness, so the core of my argument, people felt neglected for their groups. So they said, like, these groups aren't seen in Germany, that they couldn't express this, so you can't voice your support for the AfD, you can't be a man anymore, you can't do what they considered traditional or typically male, for example. And then I also, more extremely actually, they felt disrespected for this. And as a consequence, kind of, they longed for this uniqueness, saying, well, we should actually accept and allow more differences, which they often then exemplified by calling for respect towards traditional sexual orientations, or we should allow men to be men again and women to be women again, and so on. So these are basically the results, and just to summarize, I consider this supportive of the argument that they actually really felt strong belonging to society, but felt unrecognized. And this is what Marilyn Brewer then would summarize as this exclusion at the center, following my argument. However, I know that people often are disappointed if you don't show any lengthy quotes from a qualitative paper. So this just kind of shows or illustrates the forms of lacking uniqueness that I've just talked about. The first one is this being neglected as a man. The second being, the first one is not feeling seen, being neglected as East German. The second one is lacking expression as a man. And the third one, this calling for uniqueness, saying, well, everybody else is kind of raised and shown, and I need to make my voice heard, and consequently I support the AfD. Yeah, just to sum up, I think really a strength of this paper is that it kind of tries to explain how even prototypical or self-perceived prototypical members of society could feel socially excluded. And this is just a very first test, and I'm currently working on a paper where I test this quantitatively with white identifiers in the US. So again, a majority group feeling socially excluded, perhaps because they feel subjectively unrecognized in US society. And also I think it really helped me to kind of speak with these voters rather than speaking about, because usually in my quantitative papers, I kind of tend to forget about the people behind these numbers. Obviously, this is questionable how generalizable these results are, therefore quantitative analyses are needed. And this is not a causal argument, right? I don't say people feel unrecognized, therefore socially excluded, and therefore they support the radical right. We know that there are these self-victimization narratives around them. Well, thanks for listening. Thanks to all our interviewees, and I'm looking forward to your comments and questions.
Many thanks. Obviously, a lot of clapping hands from the audience. So then let's move on to the discussion. I think Sofia can switch on her camera as well. So please use the chat function or just raise your hand and open your mic to ask questions if you have a question for one of the two presenters or ideally for both of them. Paul, why don't you start?
Thanks. Just a really the same question to both of you, actually, to both Luca and Sofia. Sofia's talking about stigmatization, and Luca, you're talking about the characteristics of the voters. How do we know that these are not characteristics of other parties? I mean, what's the evidence that this is any different to any other parties? And I know the answer to that. It's a lot of work to do other parties, isn't it? But I do think one needs a kind of defense of that, given that I'm going to guess that if I did a little research, I'd find that the Sweden Democrats and the AFD are the most studied parties in their party systems. What about the other parties? And with the stigmatization one, I strongly suspect that they are more stigmatized. But it'd be interesting whether there is a kind of stigmatization about parties in general. So it's a sort of comparative question for both of you.
Okay, I'm gonna go first. Thank you very much, Paul, for your question. It's a great question, actually. And I think there are several ways to look at that. So in my case, okay, there is this kind of stigmatization that is really the product of the development of very strong social norms in the post-World War II, basically, against racism, anti-Semitism, and so on, that makes the stigmatization that the populist radical right is subject to particularly severe and strong, especially in certain countries. So those kind of reactions that these people are subject to on their daily basis, it is find out that they are party members of, for instance, the SD. I doubt that can be compared to, I don't know, members of center-left or center-right parties, right? In terms of the kind of mechanisms that I uncover, I think two of them, one of them is pretty much related to the populist radical right, and I think that's the one of the education, because again, it's the whole role of the social networks and the fact that these people, if they have university degrees and so on, probably are not surrounded by many people sharing their views. I think already from the public sector one, I would probably suspect that it extends also to right-wing parties in general, rather than only populist radical right. And regardless hypothesis on the social norms, I think that's pretty widespread. It's simply if we have relatives or friends of the people around us that support our views, of any party, I mean, we feel more comfortable with it. And as regards being a party member in general, I mean, that's a nice question to investigate. I think, we know that people have grown a little bit detached from political parties. Maybe being a party member is not something as cool, but I still think that, yeah, the kind of social and material costs that people involved in the populist radical right are subject to is not comparable.
If I may just add, Paul, I think this is a very interesting question indeed, because my paper tries basically to take up this narrative of radical right voters being socially excluded, and researchers have found so many reasons why they've apparently should feel socially excluded because they are what Hans-Peter Kruse calls economic losers, because they are in some rural areas and so on. And I don't really find this consistent, and it also doesn't really map with their self-perception. And I think, like, objectively, if you're looking at this optimal distinctiveness model, I mean, there are parties that really represent actual minorities, right? So left parties, for example, represent people who belong to social minorities, sexual minorities and so on, but also people who perhaps don't even have citizenship and so on. So I think this is really a difference, and I just want to kind of argue that radical right voting is not about being socially marginalized. Perhaps it's about being social exclusion, but then because of this other need, and not because they kind of don't belong to any larger group. And I think indeed it would be interesting to replicate these studies, basically looking at the social inclusion model and see what electorate feels socially excluded as consequence of what problem. Yeah.
I think Duncan raised his hand, I guess, as a follow-up.
No, mine's a question for Luca. Yeah, so thanks for the presentation, Luca. I found it really, really fascinating. I just a couple of things. I was wondering, did you get a sense of how the feelings that interviewees expressed linked to their support for the AFD? I mean, I noticed very quickly on the last quote that you put up that there was something about that, but I wondered sort of more generally, did people talk about those feelings of, you know, not being left behind or somewhat alienated, that directly fed into their decision to support the AFD? And secondly, something that you touched on briefly, but you didn't obviously have time to go into it more. I'm wondering what differences you found between AFD voters in the East and the West, because I'm not an expert in German politics, but I would imagine that there's generally a sense amongst AFD voters in the East that they've been treated like second-class citizens since unification. So I'm just wondering, did you find those differences amongst your interviewees?
Yeah, thank you very much, Duncan. So I should say that our sample was quite heterogeneous in terms of education and income and so on. So there were really, which was good for me, right? Because they brought up different subgroups that were relevant to them. And I could definitely say, to answer your second question first, that people in East Germany were more aware of their role as East Germans, and they felt unseen, and they weren't really considered since unification and so on. However, there were also other East Germans who said that this is completely a narrative made up by East Germans to kind of explain why they behave the way they do, but like that they weren't, that like economic differences, for example, wouldn't make such a difference. So they weren't really consistent. I think like this nostalgia related to East German, the East German history, this so-called Eastalgia, was actually a thing. And then with regards to your first question, I could say that people said that they are supporting the radical right also because this party promises to recognize majority's needs. So, for example, the AFD campaigns for Germany but normal. So traditional sexual orientations, respect for women working from staying at home and so on. But also like arguing that whites should still be a majority in Germany and so on. So I think actually the party catered to people's demands for this recognition of majorities. Yeah.
Okay. Thanks, Luca.
Okay.
Thanks, Frederick. May I hand over to you?
Yes, thank you. I have a question for Sofia. First of all, thanks a lot for sharing this. I think it's super exciting work. It's an interesting question and a great design. So kudos for that. Very happy to see it. You showed a coefficient plot at one point. So were those coefficients output from a single model? So it had like the main effects and the controls? Okay, yeah. So I think that all looks great, and I think it's a totally solid way of testing your hypotheses. But I think I'm not sure that you can interpret the coefficients on the control variables in a meaningful way. This is sometimes referred to as the table 2 fallacy, because essentially, you have the controls because they are causally prior to the treatment you care about. That means that they are confounded by post-treatment adjustment bias because the main coefficients are there. And so you can't really know, like for example, stuff about like economic background or left-right position. You just need to develop a separate model to test those. So I think that could be interesting, but that's just a thought I had when you commented on it, that there's some bias that affects those estimates. But again, thanks for sharing this super exciting work.
Thanks for your suggestion. I will follow it, and yeah, thank you very much. I'll try also that way. Thanks.
A lot of questions today. That's fantastic. So, Stan, may I hand over to you right away?
Hi, sorry, I had to press some buttons. Can you hear me okay? Hi, sorry if I missed it. Maybe I missed you both saying something during your presentations. Thanks very much for these very interesting papers. I just wondered, it's kind of an open question to both of you. To what extent do you think that like a feeling of stigmatization might be actively enhanced or perpetuated by party membership, because it creates kind of a common bond? It's like us versus them, and it might also be an interest of the party leadership to get this idea, like, okay, you're not being listened to by all the other parties, and we're the only party that actually listens to your need. So in that way, a feeling of stigmatization might actually be enhanced, so to speak. So I wondered if you have any thoughts on that.
Yeah, I'll go first then. Based on the nodding, I see that we all agree with this comment. Thanks, Stein. I think that's the reason why I didn't only want to look into radical right voters as a subgroup, but all these majorities, because absolutely it's, and therefore I also said it's not a causal argument, right? Which I couldn't also measure with qualitative research anyway. But there is this self-stigmatization of radical right parties. There's this paper by Yolanda Yettin, for example, that really argues for that. So this is a problem, right? But I think when it comes to the lack of recognition of majority subgroups, this is something that the radical right does not necessarily always address. So they talk about us being stigmatized and so on, us versus them, but talking about East Germans, talking about traditional sexual orientations, men, white people, and so on. This is also present, this victimization, but it's not as strong. So I think there you could actually say that this is not necessarily only due to radical right parties' narratives.
Okay, I'll go next. Thanks for your question. And yeah, I think, okay, I have a double view on that, because in terms of, you know, the narrative of us versus them, or feelings of belonging, as Luca was saying, in terms of fostering a collective identity, of course, I think stigmatization does that. And I found that also in my interviews, it will enhance these as feelings, right, among the members, and they feel this sort of martyrs that have decided to join this party despite the cost. In terms of what you were saying about the party leadership, I'm not quite sure. I still think that in terms of party organization, those feelings of stigmatization remain a major obstacles for the ST and other still marginalized parties, let's say, because I've noticed in the interviews that it hinders activism. I mean, those people that feel stigmatized, they don't become actives, they don't go to party meetings, eventually they don't go forward as candidates. And we know the ST is growing a lot, and now they keep on having the difficulties in filling the list. So I think if the ST wants to grow organizationally, it needs to solve the problem of stigmatization, because if from the side of people, yeah, it may foster this collective identity. On the organizational side, it remains a major obstacle.
Annika, you want to ask a question?
I do. I actually this last round has sort of like answered a little bit of that. One of my questions was to Sofia exactly about the relationship between feeling stigmatized and being active. Does it make people more or less active? So that and sort of, yeah, and so that one is solved. But also actually I had the exact sort of coming from the exact opposite side around especially the feeling of belonging from what Stein is saying. And this is my question to Luca, is whether, if I understand you correctly, you're mainly looking at whether people feel belonging to sort of the German society. I wonder whether you actually, do you find anything that the people now feel, that get that feeling of belonging from the party? Like, does the party give them what they're seeking from society? And then also, if I saw your data, if I saw this correctly, you have a few you had a few respondents who are actually active in local politics. Are these people different in their feeling of belonging? Does that sort of being active actually create a feeling of belonging, or does it alienate them even more because they have sort of been actively in the mainstream politics? And then in Sofia's, in your presentation, now I know you focus a lot on those people that feel stigmatized. But if I remember correctly, you also have 40% of respondents who say, not at all, like who totally disagree to your statement. And I'm just wondering, have you had a look at who these people are, who seem to feel completely not stigmatized and feel very happy with their party membership? I mean, are they very extreme, or are they so ideological that they don't care, or do they have any other kind of characteristics in common that differentiate them from the others?
Okay, I'm gonna go first now. So I think I partly replied to the question of the relationship between stigma and being active, and yeah, stigma hinders levels of activism. Then I will, yeah, make some further analysis probably for another paper on more the real implications of this. In terms of your second suggestion, it's a great one actually, and I will look more carefully into it. For now, the provisory answer is that they are mostly men, that's for sure. Like, men feel way less the stigma than women. That was a significant difference. That was a significant difference. But yeah, actually, I'm gonna look more in depth at other variables, that maybe there is something interesting going on among that group too. So thanks for that.
Yeah, then I'll answer to your questions, Annika. I think that's really true. Do these parties help people belong? And I mean, they belong to this superordinate national identity quite strongly. So I think that is something that I can say. What is interesting is, do these parties help people feeling recognized? And I think there it does. So they kind of refer to politicians highlighting the needs of man, or remembering that white people also matter in Germany. This whole white lives matter debate was brought up a couple of times. So I think people kind of experience that radical right parties help them to be recognized. And then secondly, what is the difference between political representatives there? And I mean, I could say that they were more used to kind of arguing for this narrative of we are unrecognized, specifically when it came to like political issues, like we as like 6 million people and so on vote for us and for our party, and we're still not recognized and so on. But I would actually again say that this was quite diverse also in how how they felt recognized with all their other different subgroups. So I wouldn't say that there are subgroup differences between these two, but also this is probably not doable with the data really to be meaningful. Yeah.
Are there any other questions from the audience? If there are no questions, I have some questions too. And that's a question to both of you, because one thing that I've been wondering about is, well, why do they feel stigmatized? Why do they feel excluded, right? And we could come up with a couple of different arguments here that actually relate to this inherent question of the character of populist parties and populist radical right parties, right? So is it because they hear narratives, for example, in Germany, particularly in the 2017 election, you heard quite prominent politicians saying things like 87% of German citizens voted for democratic parties, the rest are just fascists, kind of, right? So this is very much about the anti-democratic nature of the AfD, for example, right? But you could make arguments about being far right, right, being racist or anti-Muslim or something like this. But you could also make similar arguments about being populist in the sense, right? That, well, you portray a conflict or divide between the people and the needs are simply not there. You're not willing to compromise, something like this, right? So what does your qualitative evidence, probably more than the quantitative evidence, tell us about the dimensions of being excluded, dimensions of being stigmatized, beyond explaining what are the features that make people feel stigmatized, but in what dimensions? Is there some variation in there? Could your data speak to this as well?
Okay, I'll go first. Yeah, I think this is also, this relates to what Stein probably asked. So this feeling of stigma, I would say, is actually something that we kind of know by now, that this is what people have, and I think therefore it's good that Sofia actually shows who of the voters actually feels that. But again, this was the motivation for me to look into other groups that actually kind of represent, so not like the party itself and that voters feel stigmatized for voting for this party, but that people feel stigmatized for being a majority member and perhaps as a consequence supporting the radical right. So I also recall these 2017 kind of reactions to the strong AfD support, and therefore I would say this is actually not in my data the most interesting stuff where people feel stigmatized for being an AfD voter, but feeling stigmatized for another party. And then, as Annika asked, is this support for this party actually kind of a sign that these parties signal recognition of being a majority member, and that is a fine as well? And apparently it does to some extent.
Yeah, thanks for your question, Robert. Yeah, I think some of my qualitative material of the interview speak also to that. Now, starting with the premise again, that I think in the case of the Sweden Democrats, a lot of that is because of the extremist right roots of the party that now they're trying to, shed away. But also that dimension of the being populist, let's say, like populism at its core was pretty much there. And there was really this idea that the SD people were the only people who told the truth, the only people who had the courage to face certain issues, the only people who care about Sweden. Because if you feel Swedish in Sweden and you're a nationalist, like you're seen badly. Therefore, it's almost that they took on this mission of caring about Sweden or be the only one doing this, that, eventually led them to stigmatization. So there were a lot of populist tropes also there in my interviews, for sure.
Many thanks. Are there any other questions? If not, do you have a question, Annika, or you want to wrap up?
If there are no other questions, I'm sure that both Sofia and Luca will be very happy about any comments, feedbacks, requests for papers, etc. That anybody has afterwards, and also anyone who watches the YouTube video and has any thoughts on those two papers. And then it just, first of all, leaves me to thank Luca and Sofia again for their fantastic presentations and congratulate them both for their really, really innovative projects. And I want to just briefly share with you all sorry, no, come here. There we go. And just briefly share with you our next sessions. In this season, we have 2 more sessions to go in the populism seminar, and that is on the 9th of May. We have another panel or 2 really great papers on how populists react to our challenges, so more from the actors side. And then we wrap up this season on the 23rd of May with another roundtable where we discuss with 3 experts strategies against populism and whether anti-populism is indeed a strategy and a solution to the dangers of populism. But all of this, of course, will also be communicated on Twitter and all the usual channels. So it just leaves me to thank you all for coming. Thank you everyone in the audience for quickly changing moving with us on the Zoom channel, and hopefully see you all again on the 9th of May, and have a really good rest of your day or evening.
Thank you so much, Annika and Robert. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much.
Bye-bye.